was a civil rights activist in the United States, a rather famous one. And what he meant by the arc of the moral universe is the way that society progresses over time towards equality. What he meant by this is that though social change takes a long time to happen, the world that we live in will someday be a better place. This quote is a really great rallying call because it helps people feel like their efforts to make the world better are not futile. And it gives us hope for the future that we will live in and that our children and grandchildren will live in. But I'm here today to talk about why thinking that the world is on a slow but steady march towards justice can be harmful. So for those of you who don't recognize this photo, it was taken during the 2014 riots in Ferguson, Mississippi. These riots began as a peaceful protest after the murder of an unarmed black boy named Michael Brown, who was shot and killed walking home at night by a white police officer. So during the ensuing violence of the riots, many relatively well-informed and socially conscious people said things like, "It's as though we've taken a step back 50 years into US history." And what they meant mainly by this was that it was a step back to these riots in 1965 in Selma, Alabama. The similarities between the two are striking. Selma, like Ferguson, began as a peaceful protest after the murder of an unarmed black boy named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was shot and killed in a restaurant near his home. And the similarities are striking because the violence and magnitude of the responses occurred only after the police attempted to disperse the crowds using tear gas and water cannons, respectively. But the problem with calling Ferguson a step back 50 years into US history is that it suggests that in the interim, nothing terrible has happened. It ignores the fact that policemen in the United States are estimated to kill someone every 7 hours, and that these people are 3 times more likely to be black than to be white. And according to the Mapping Police Violence database, only 30% of cases in which black men are shot and killed by the police are they even thought to have a weapon or accused of a violent crime. So when we call Selma a step back into US history, we are ignoring the past 50 years of violence and brutality that define the American justice system in communities all over the United States. We are ignoring the past 50 years of police murdering unarmed black men and boys. So then what does it mean to move backwards? Generally, as Westerners, our perception of a society that has moved backwards is one in which social liberties that have been gained through social movement are reversed or regressed. These can be legal policies, like a society that had given women the right to vote, taking back that right. But they can also be social norms, like if a society that had started accepting women in government stopped voting for female representatives. However, many of the societies that we consider to be backwards are just not moving at the same pace as societies that have. They haven't granted those rights to minority groups and couldn't have taken them away. The reason that I use air quotes when I say moving at the same pace and progress, and gosh, this is sensitive, is because almost all of the language that we have to describe social movements has to go with linear progression. So linear progression is basically the movement from point A to point B with no interruption in between. And in this case, it's referring to the movement of a society from inequality to equality over time, with progress getting only better for people and never getting worse. And another issue with looking at societies as moving forwards is that generally our perception of moving forwards is becoming more democratic, more industrial, and more westernized. But rather than being a linear spectrum, Societies tend to fluctuate between equality and inequality over time. For example, we would generally look at a pastoral headman in 2017 living without electricity, running water, or modern forms of transportation in a rural area as living as though he is in pre-industrial times. But I think we can all accept the year he lives in is still 2017. The way we experience time is linear. The way that we experience social progress, however, looks a lot more like this. It's complicated, it's messy, and it doesn't have a specific direction as it moves between equality and inequality. So let's get back to the concept of moving backwards. Can anyone tell me where they think these photos were taken? Just shout it out.
At the beach.
You're on.
Thanks for that. Yeah, these photos were taken in Iran during the 1930s to the 1970s. And here are some pictures of Iran today. Now, obviously I chose these photos to suit my narrative. There were, of course, people in Iran during the time that the first set were taken who observed much more traditional Islamic codes of dress. And there are women in Iran today who do not wear the headscarf when outside of their own homes, and whose dress we would consider to be far more westernized. But the fact is that the political climates of these two time periods are incredibly different. So these photos were taken in what is referred to as the Pahlavi era. It began in the early 1930s when Reza Shah Pahlavi came into power in Iran, and he instituted a number of policies meant to bring Iranian culture towards westernization and female equality. Now, these policies, good or bad, outlawed the headscarf, and they gave women many rights in government, rights in marriage, like the ability to divorce, to take care of their children, to have custody, just all of these things that brought women towards a more equal status in society as men. During the 1979 Islamic Revolution, however, women lost many of the rights that they gained under Pahlavi. Women to this day are legally required to wear a headscarf or a veil whenever they leave their own homes. Women have little to no rights in marriage. They cannot ask for a divorce, initiate a marriage, have custody over their children, or even leave the country without their husband's permission. I recently found out that it's a current issue in Iran with women trying to regain the right to attend sporting events. Of course, over the past 40 years since the revolution, women have gained back many of the rights that they lost during the original chaos. And there are women still working in Iran today to move themselves in a direction we would consider forwards. But Iran is still a strong example of a society that we as Westerners may consider to be backwards. Of course, this is not the first time in history that we would have considered to have moved backwards in terms of minorities gaining and losing rights within a relatively short amount of time. During World Wars I and II, women were forced to enter the workforce at a much higher rate because men were drafted into the army. And these women were able to take over jobs that had historically belonged to men, like running military operations and call centers and factories, participating in government, and taking care of their children, along with gaining rights to property. However, after the war ended, many of these same women were fired from their jobs to make space for male workers, or paid far less than the men who were doing the same jobs that they were. And this is still an issue, especially in the United States today, where the wage gap is that a woman makes 75 cents to a man's dollar. The issue with looking at time and social movements as linear, as a progression from A to B, is not only that it allows us to ignore societies that don't necessarily move the way that we think they should, but it also allows us to be ignorant of humanitarian crises that are still an issue outside of where they are relevant to our own lives. So Simon Doonan, who is a fashion designer and a gay rights activist in the United States, famously said, "To those of you who are not around, I can only say this: you have no idea how lucky you are." He was referring to what I call the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. And as a young gay teenager in the United States, I learned about the AIDS crisis in a very specific and limited way. My story of the HIV/AIDS crisis began in 1981, when the first 5 cases were reported in the United States, called gay pneumonia, or alternatively, gay cancer. By 1985, every region in the world was reporting at least 1 case of HIV. And it wasn't until 1988 that the United States finally opened up a program for dealing with the virus. By 1995, nearly 10 years after it became a worldwide crisis, the first antiretroviral therapy was approved for human consumption. And a year later, the United Nations formed a committee on the prevention of AIDS. And that's it. That's the end of the story as I knew it. It was something to be looked back on, to be sad about, to remember our struggle. But the fact is that we here in Swaziland are living in the middle of an AIDS crisis today. And the country that we all live in, over 30% of the population is infected with HIV. Because the fact is that the story didn't actually end in 1996 with the formation of UNAID. It continued in 1999 when AIDS became the #1 killer on the African continent, with 16,000 new infections every single day. In 2016, it was estimated that 18.2 million people are on ARVs worldwide, and that is only 54% of the people eligible for treatment. Because we as a global community often look at issues that are solved within our areas of the world as fixed, it is easy to ignore that other people still struggle. And this is in part because we can't just look across the globe, we don't see everything that's going on. But it is mainly because social movements are rarely intersectional. Groups advocate for their own needs and often don't recognize or prioritize the struggles of others. An example of this, near and dear to my heart, is the women's suffrage movement in the United States and Western Europe of the 1890s to the 1950s. Women of color were systemically excluded from the movement, and many of the suffragettes who I had grown to admire used the fact that black men could vote as a reason for why white women should be able to. Anna Howard Shaw, who was president of the National Women's Association and until very recently one of my heroes, famously said, "I had seen women overworked and underpaid, doing men's jobs at half men's wages, not because their work was inferior, but because they were women." Yeah, I recently found out that she was the same person who said, "You have put the ballot into the hands of your black man, thus making him the political superior of white women. Never before in the history of the world have men made former slaves the political masters of their former mistresses." Yeah. And even earlier when I said that a woman in the US makes 75 cents to the man's dollar, I was, of course, referring to the white woman's 75 cents to the white man's dollar. If we look at median earnings in terms of looking at the wage gap by race across the globe, you can see that Asian men and women are doing the best. But white men still make more than Asian women, who make more than white women, who make more than black men, and so forth and so on. So how can we move forwards in a society? How can we move towards justice in a society where many consider the rights and progress of others to be less important than or even harmful to their own? And this mentality is particularly dangerous because it gives us leaders like Geert, you may recognize these people, I hope that you do. Geert Wilders, who is the leader of the Dutch Party for Freedom. Marine Le Pen, who is the leader of the French National Front Party, Nigel Farage, former leader of the UK Independence Party, and of course, Donald Trump, the current Republican leader of the United States government. So, if any of us are unfamiliar with the current rise of fascism within the Western world, over the past year alone, conservatives across the United States and Western Europe have gained considerably in power and traction, and that is in no little part due to the refugee crisis ongoing. That is in no little part due to the advances that minorities have made in those societies. Because the fact is that these conservatives, with party names like Freedom, the National Front, and Independence, promise separation, isolationism from the rest of the world. They have policies like Brexit and America First, which seek to foster xenophobia, block out migrants and refugees, and foster mistrust among minority groups. It is one of the oldest and most disgusting political strategies in the book. People in power who don't want to lose the top seat who are against social progress convince minority groups that only one can advance at the cost of the rest. And it is surprising how often we swallow that. How much we think that progress is linear and individual. And to take that back to the moral arc of the universe, one of the most critical reasons we believe that the world is on a steady state to get better is because it allows us to be complacent. It allows us to focus on our own interests, on issues that excite us or are relevant to our own lives. Because we think that no matter what, if we push for what we believe in, the whole world is just going to move in the same direction. We're eventually going to all have justice. But the fact is that the moral arc of the universe does not bend towards justice. It is pushed that way. There is nothing wrong with thinking that the world will eventually be a better place. But it is necessary to recognize that without an integrated, intersectional, and sustained approach, things will not get better on their own. We must not give in to complacency or expect all societies to move in the same direction, at the same pace, and at the same time. If we want the world we live in to bend towards justice, we have to take it there. Thank you.